rubrics, I guess for us, are pretty important in Schoolbox because we use them for our analysis of assessment of tasks. And I guess we wanted to look at what they really are, because we find there's a lot of misunderstanding and different definitions of what rubrics are in different schools. So firstly, we're going to start by defining what they are to us. So for us, a rubric really is a scoring guide that is used to evaluate the quality of a student's responses. It is an attempt to communicate expectations of quality around a task. And this is really important that it is actually around the idea of a task. It's really important that we understand that it is specific to the task that the student is being asked to complete. What I guess for us a rubric is a set of criteria and levels used to assess a task. It defines the various levels and quality of a student's response, and it should communicate expectations of what the student is required to do. So it should be readable for the student so that they can understand what is required. A criteria marking sheet or a rubric is not a criteria marking sheet. It's not a series of criteria that are marked with letter or number grades. And a rubric is also not your curriculum or set up as a definition of your curriculum. Although a rubric may use your standards and outcomes within the rubric, it's not specifically used to define your curriculum. And finally, just quickly, a rubric should answer the following questions. What are you going to get the students to do? And how well do you expect them to do it? So obviously looking at rubrics and the anatomy of the rubric, rubrics are broken into three main areas: capabilities, indicators, levels, descriptors. Okay? The capabilities and indicators, these may be called other things: criteria, outcomes, skills. The skills are logical groupings that we measured on this task. So these can be knowledge, they can be behaviours, they can be dispositions. These are important to keep consistent across multiple assessments, as they will be used later to build progression by reassessing the same indicators multiple times. And that's a really important point, because later on when we talk about mapping progression, it's going to be really important that you reuse your indicators. So it's important that indicators aren't task specific. They actually do get reused. So you're reassessing students on the same skills over multiple assessments. The descriptors might be different, but it is important to reuse those indicators multiple times. The levels across the top, these indicate the standard level that the column represents. They may be aligned to standards or standards-based assessment. They may also be aligned to other grading systems, such as competencies or even letter grades, although this isn't really recommended. But we do know that many schools do use the levels aligned to their letter grades. I guess also it's important to make sure the levels are discrete. So each level represents a discrete level that the students can achieve. So no sort of things like levels 1 to 3 or something like that. They should all be discrete levels. And finally, the descriptor is made up of two parts, the descriptor and the points. So the descriptor is the actual definition of what the student needs to do for each level for that particular skill. So that should clearly and articulate what the student actually needs to do to achieve that level. And then finally, the points indicate, when we're looking at analysis and weightings and things like that, the points are used to do later analysis on that descriptor so that we can work out how much value that particular skill and level is worth in the context of this assessment. Okay, let's move on now. Just quickly, let's go over what the benefits really are to rubrics. So for us, the benefits are they create a standard and consistent marking across the entire cohort. It's really important for us, I guess, because we run Schoolbox, and we see that they are really a really fundamental part of the continuous reporting journey. So for us, rubrics in Schoolbox form the basis of all of our continuous reporting. So using rubrics to mark major assessments will ensure consistent marking across the entire cohort. This ensures your data will be consistent. When we're doing analysis of assessment result data in Schoolbox, one of the most common things that we find is inconsistency between assessments and marking practices. With rubrics, we can remove many of those inconsistencies, and then we actually get better quality data for analysis. If we don't fix up these issues with the data, we end up having all sorts of issues with the analysts, such as finding that different assessment tasks are measuring different things or being marked different ways. They all end up causing, issues with the data that we can't actually avoid without implementing a good quality rubric for that assessment. Another common question that we get asked at Schoolbox is how are students progressing throughout the year? And traditional marking systems really, the way they would work is that you would get an A and then an A and then a B. And that didn't really tell you much about whether you had progressed. It was only within the context of that particular assessment that you got that grade. But by aligning our rubrics to standards of competencies, we can actually measure the progression of specific skills. So that then we can actually tell you questions about whether the students got emerging, or competent, or at standard about those specific skills. And we can actually track that progression over time. So it's very important with a rubric that if we align them to a standard, we can actually tell you about progression. Without that, we can't see how the student has improved over time. From a student's perspective, and it's really important when we're thinking about rubrics to not just think about them from, our own perspective, but also from the student's perspective. From a student's perspective, they do provide a huge amount of information to students about what is expected. It allows the students to analyse and understand what needs to be done before submissions, and this will enable the students to take control of their own learning. So by empowering the students with the information, they're going to be better informed to actually achieve the result that you're looking for, the level of quality that you're looking for in that particular assessment. Once marked for students, rubrics also show areas of weakness or strength and provide constructive feedback about what could be done better. All of this without the teacher writing a single handwritten comment. So a simple rubric can inform the student about what they need to work on, what they did really well, and where they can actually do or improve their skills. As rubrics are so transparent in terms of assessments, they will also enable self and peer assessment. So because students are able to look at the rubric, they are actually able to also assess themselves and also assess their peers against the same rubric. This gives us a great opportunity for students to think critically about the assessment and actually demonstrate that they understand what the assessment is trying to achieve. So without a rubric, self-assessment and peer assessment is very hard. But with that rubric, it gives a really great framework for the students to start thinking about what it is that makes a great assessment. And finally, from the teacher's perspective, rubric creation is really hard. There's no doubt about it. It takes a lot of time. I'm not going to lie, it's one of those things that you just need to invest that time up front. It's one of those things that you can, it is costly, but it pays itself back over time. So over time, you'll get from rubrics an increase in marking speed, because selecting the boxes within a rubric is far easier than writing detailed feedback or comments on your assessments. And reusability of good assessments reusability of rubrics from good assessments and rubrics can be used by the entire cohort. They can be shared across teachers and be reused year after year by different teachers. So once you have made that investment in a good rubric, they do obviously pay back over time, but it is one of those things you have to invest in upfront to be able to get the value. And finally, from a teacher's perspective, the data collected using a rubric in an LMS, such as Schoolbox, can further refine learning practice. You can look at the analysis of that rubric data and find where your weaknesses are against particular skills, where perhaps your students need more support, or perhaps where you've covered topics really well. And that can then further refine and help you refine your teaching practice. So next, let's look at how to create, I guess, a great rubric, what it is that makes up an excellent rubric. So firstly, a step of defining and building a great rubric is actually to work out what is being actually assessed. So building a great assessment is actually the first part of building a great rubric. So first off, we need to look at what exactly is the assigned task. What is an excellent example of a great piece of student work? That's going to define our highest level, and what's going to identify what it is that we're actually looking for in the perfect piece of work. And what kind of feedback do you want to give students on their work and performance? Because that's going to identify what types of things we're going to want to write in our descriptors and our criteria. Next up, we need to look at the skills being assessed. So identifying the skills, we need to break them down before, like I talked about, into capabilities and indicators. The capabilities are optional, but they do allow you to group skills together logically. They may also allow you to roll up the results. So you might have an overall grade for a particular capability. So having a capability grouping does give you the ability to, I guess, group your skills together. The main purpose of, I guess, this stage of identifying the skills being assessed is to develop consistent capabilities and indicators that you will use over multiple assessments. So you actually need to take a step back here and make sure that they are consistent across all of the work that you're doing and that they are aligned to the curriculum so that you can track students' progress over multiple assessments against specific outcomes or skills that you're teaching. These skills need to be generic enough that they can be reused. So you need to make sure that they are reusable and not just specific to this particular assessment. But if they are reusable, you'll be able to track them over time and measure them multiple times as students develop and then show and demonstrate that skill over multiple assessments. One of the things with the skills being assessed, I guess with one of the approaches and how to go about this is to look at it from the curriculum perspective. So one of the common examples is to look at, say, for example, the Australian National Curriculum and break it down via the curriculum. So in the curriculum, they have capabilities. I've got an example here for Science Year 3. And in Science Year 3, they have the capabilities of science and understanding, science as a human endeavour, and science inquiry skills. And those capabilities will then have subtasks within them to demonstrate their knowledge, their analytical skills, and important those holistic inquiry skills that they've demonstrated in this assessment. One of the things that it's important to note when looking at your skills is that they don't necessarily just need to be analytical skills. You can measure holistic skills as well. You can be creative about what makes up a holistic learner. We've seen lots of different examples of what is measured, and things like dispositions, like collaboration, organisation, even classroom behaviours and things like that can be measured on a rubric. So you don't necessarily need to be just looking at analytical skills. You can look at the whole learner and show their progress on those types of skills over time as well. When you're looking at the knowledge areas, one of the things you're probably looking at is things like vocabulary, essay structure, comprehension, use of evidence. These are the types of skills that you're looking to measure typically in the indicators area. Most teachers are pretty familiar with doing this work already, so most of you will know the specific skills. So this step there is fairly straightforward generally to write down and document into your rubrics. Next is the levels. Now, the levels are fairly important because, like I mentioned earlier, these relate to how we measure progression. So having good levels allows us to actually measure how students are performing across over time. One of the things with levels, though, is there's many different approaches to them, and there's no right or wrong approach. And I'm going to go through 3 or 4 different approaches that we've seen that may give you some ideas of how you might set up your levels. I should note that it is important often to keep these levels consistent across the school. it does help when you're doing analysis of the data that everything's on a standard level, because you can then compare across year levels, you compare across subject barriers. All of those things can start to happen once you have everything standardized on a single level. So some of the standards that we've seen, some of the levels that we've seen that people use, firstly, there's an option aligned to the standards. So below, approaching, at standard, above standard. It's a fairly common Australian curriculum sort of alignment, and that works really well for tracking progression. As students enter the year, they start below or approaching, and hopefully as they move throughout the year, they move up through those levels. So it's one of those things where when you take away the grades, it's no longer a matter of the student getting a specific grade. It's actually where they're at in their current learning that's more important. And having that discussion with teachers, students and parents is a really important discussion to talk about. It's not just about the grade, it's actually about your progress. And having a level system that shows progression is really a good way to do that. Another method that we've seen a lot of is what's called mastery. This idea that you can, great for doing things like analytical skills and things like that, where you start with limited, then go to emerging, and then proficient, and then mastery. And so that idea of mastering a skill can also be represented within the levels. Some other options as well, although not commonly used, things like holistic levels as well. So sometimes when you're measuring holistic things, they don't obviously go on a progression or a mastery. They're more things like beginning, developing, satisfactory, and exceptional. Levels like this give you the ability to be more holistic about your grading. They can obviously have problems when compared across assessments because they do not show progression. But, all in all, they're good for giving a student, a point in time about what their behaviour is like or how well they've behaved in that particular instance. And finally, there's a way to actually use rubrics to align to grades. Now, we don't obviously think this is a great idea, but you can still maintain a grading system. And many of our schools where they're reporting to government systems obviously need to still report using grades. And in those systems, you can use grades as your levels. So having an A, B, C as your level, that's fine. And then you develop descriptors for each of those particular levels so that students can get an understanding of how they can achieve those letter grades using your rubric as well. So once we get to the next stage, what is each level? We're really talking about the descriptors. So descriptors are probably the hardest part of rubric writing. These obviously describe what the student does for each indicator to achieve that particular level within the rubric. They need to be brief, they need to be clear, they need to be student readable and parsable, they need to be positive, and obviously we like to avoid the use of adjectives, so they shouldn't be too subjective. So doing things like saying good or excellent or things like that don't really clearly describe what it is that you want the student to do. So you need to be more specific. But at the same time, you need to avoid using things like counts because they then lock the student into doing specific numbers of things rather than trying to do a specific quality of things. So they are difficult to write, and I could probably spend a whole day just talking about how to write descriptors. But it's one of those things that you don't need to get right immediately. You can, of course, improve over time. You can start out, and we're going to do some quick examples up next and have a look at what it is that makes up a good rubric and a descriptor and why they might be good or bad. So let's do a quick demo, and I'm going to run you through a quick assessment task. And the assessment task that we're doing here is that we're going to assess how clean is my kitchen. It's actually not my kitchen, but we'll go with how clean is my kitchen. So we're looking here at a standard kitchen. It's got a bit of mess on it. It's not entirely clean. It's not perfect, but it's not too bad either. So we're going to have a look at how to write a good rubric to assess the cleanliness of this kitchen. So let's start with a bad example. Now, I've got a bad example of a rubric here. It's a pretty simplistic example. We've gone and we've broken the skills down into the dishes, the counter, and the sinks. And we've then got a scale from inadequate, mediocre, satisfactory, ideal, surpassing. Now, I've made a few fundamental mistakes in here that make this somewhat of a difficult rubric to use. So if we're looking across dishes and we see dishes are dirty, doesn't really describe what that is or what that means or what level of dishes. Next, we have some dishes that are collected in the sink, but what is some dishes? Most dishes somewhat cleaned and rinsed, and somewhat here makes the definition very wishy-washy about what is actually cleaned and not. And then finally, dishes are sparkling clean. What is your definition of sparkling and what is my definition of sparkling might very much be different. And it goes on and on with various different examples of mistakes being made. But I guess the point here is that we want to avoid the use of adjectives. And you'll notice that 3 or 4 items are correct and not in the correct place on the counter is also an example of using counts. That doesn't really say much to the student about how a satisfactory counter should be cleaned. It just says that 3 or 4 items can be left on it for it to be satisfactory, which isn't really an ideal situation for the student to be assessed against. Moving on to having a look at how we can improve that rubric. And once again, looking at my kitchen. Here we've got an example of a further improved rubric where we've cleaned up and refined the definitions. And looking across the top, inadequate now is defined as dishes are not done, as simple as that. Mediocre, dishes collected in sink. So if there's dishes in the sink, then it's mediocre. Satisfactory, dishes washed and rinsed but in sink. And I should note that these should grow on top of each other. So as we go through these, they should be step by step further along the line. So you don't need to necessarily repeat the same thing again like I have. I've got dishes washed twice. You can assume that once you've got to satisfactory, the dishes have been washed, and that once you get to ideal, you're looking for things further and above and beyond the dishes just being washed. So that's a good example of how we can actually improve our rubrics to make them clearer and make them more understandable to everyone. Because remember that when we use rubrics, we want them to be reusable. We want anyone to be able to pick up the rubric and be able to mark it, regardless of whether they know the assessment task or not. So anyone should be able to pick up my dishes and my kitchen dishes rubric here and mark students, and we should get consistent results from this rubric. If we find we're not getting consistent results, we can always go back and refine it further and further improve it over time. So it's very important to remember that this can be a task that we evolve over time. All right, so moving on now from rubrics and looking at what all this means. What are the next steps? So once you've started using rubrics and you've started building great rubrics, let's have a look at what you can do once you've digitized those rubrics and started using them within an LMS system such as Schoolbox. So first up on my list is your ability to analyze your data across indicators. You can utilize your data to improve your assessment practice, and you can track your student progression from year to year. So let's have a look at how we achieve that in Schoolbox. So first up, for those that use Schoolbox, you're probably familiar with this. For those that are not, this is a rubric marking screen in Schoolbox. And once you have a rubric digitized, it's really quick and easy to mark the students. So this is presented to you, you click in the boxes, you select which one they got, You leave a quick overall comment, you press continue, and it takes you on to the next student to mark. It's all returned immediately to the student and their parent, and it's a great way to optimize your marking process. It makes assessment so much faster, and it's giving good quality feedback. So not only are you faster at marking, but you're actually providing more information back to the students and potentially to their parents, all with less time. So that's one of the great benefits of having these rubrics, is the ability to assess with speed. Next up, one of the things that we started doing in Schoolbox is building box and whiskers based on the indicators that you've developed in your rubric. Now, this gives us the ability to look horizontally across the entire cohort or your particular class and see what skills have been covered, what skills haven't been covered, and what level the students are at with that particular skill. Now, over time, as you assess these multiple times, you'll build up a good understanding of where the students are in that range and hopefully develop more insights into what particular areas you have or haven't covered, or perhaps need to do more work in or revise before the upcoming exam. So this type of information is available because we put points and indicators into our rubrics. We're then able to work out where does all of that information lie across the cohort and produce a nice, simple to use box and whisker for you to look at, showing the range of students' results for that particular skill across all of the assessment tasks that have been completed. Next up, something we're just starting to get working on is the idea of identifying student progression and visualizing student progression. So in the past with letter grades, there was no possible way that we could ever visualize an A was better than an A after an A. But now as we start to move towards using standard aligned rubrics, we can actually create really great visualizations that look like this to actually show students' progress over the year in particular knowledge or skills or areas of understanding that they're actually developing over time. Now, on this graph that you're seeing here, each of the dots represents an individual assessment, and we can see that over time the students' composition and effect skills have increased. There might have been one drop off, but then it's come back again as towards the end. So we always like to see that trend line going up over time, and that's one of the great things that we can do with standard aligned rubrics, is that we can actually see the trend in students' progression. Also, the box behind the dot there just indicates the range with which the rest of the cohort performed, so that we can see whether that was just a particularly hard assessment or whether the student actually did particularly well in that assessment and outdid the standard average for the rest of the cohort as well. So it's giving quite a lot of information in that particular visualization. Of course, you can mouse over each of those assessments and see the specific descriptor given and level given for that particular feature. So that's all built into that visualization. One of the things that we can do, because we have invested in these rubrics, we've digitized the rubrics and we've made them accessible, we can start visualizing the data that they capture. So let's just wrap up. So, in summary, investing the time upfront to write high quality assessments and rubrics. And we completely understand that there is a lot of time invested in writing good quality rubrics. And it's one of those things that you'll never probably end or finish. It's going to be one of those things you constantly invest time and effort into. But if you do, the benefits are there. There is a large amount of benefits to investing in quality assessments. We have the benefits such as visibility for students. We have the benefits of being able to do analysis on the data that's captured. We have the benefits of being able to get students to think critically about that assessment. All great benefits. Obviously, we want that investment returned to you, so we return it through faster marking, more high-speed masking, but also more high-quality feedback for everyone. So for the parents and the students, they all get higher quality feedback in real time because you've got that great quality rubric underlying the feedback that's being provided back to those parents and students. And also, finally, you can always continually improve those rubrics. They're not something that you just need to do once and they're done. You can always come back and continue to refine them. So we always want to make sure that you remember that it's not an end game. It is one of those things where you can always continue to refine and improve over time. So that about sums up our quick presentation on rubrics. I would like to now ask you all to ask questions. If you've got any questions, we're going to jump online in the question area. I think we've already been answering quite a few questions. I hope you've been enjoying that. And we'll do some more question and answer sessions. I might bring up some questions and answer them over the mic. If there's any particular questions that people think I should talk to everyone, please let me know. Mm-hmm. There's a question here about cohorts, and do you mean multiple classes have used the same rubric? That's a good question from Josh. So yes, when we talk about rubrics, it is really important that we actually have multiple classes using the same rubric. That allows us to do the cohort level analysis that many schools are looking to do. If teachers are assessing to different standards or different rubrics and in different ways, we can't actually accurately assess that data across the cohort, because the difference we'll be measuring is not necessarily the difference between students, but in fact the difference between teachers. So by aligning all teachers to use the same rubrics for their major common assessment tasks, we can actually then assess that data across the entire cohort. So from Schoolbox perspective, we have the idea of a course, and so the assessment task would be developed within the course with a rubric in that course. That course would then be rolled out to all the individual classes, and so each teacher would assess against the exact same assessment task and rubric, allowing us to do really high quality analysis across the entire cohort. So that's one of the things that we're asked often to do, and so by using rubrics across that cohort, we can actually achieve that. Peter asks, does the results get sent back immediately? I see some issues around equity when students receive their marks. In Schoolbox, we don't necessarily return all the marks as soon as you mark them. That's at teacher discretion. You can, of course, mark all of the assessments and then return them to the students and change their visibility or publish those marks once you've completed your marking. So you can actually return the marks all at once if you choose. Barry asks, does rubric progression have to run from right to left? Could it run the other way? So I guess that's an age-old question. Do you go high to low or low to high? From our perspective, we don't actually mind which way you go. It really comes down to personal preference. I think even amongst our teachers here, there's a disagreement about which direction you should go. So it doesn't bother us which direction you particularly go. I think it comes down to the psychology that you want to employ. It's up to you. We're not going to say which way it needs to go. That's completely at your own teacher discretion. So Scott asks, is it possible for a teacher and student to mark and complete the same rubric? Ultimately, yes, that's what we would like to do. Currently, that feature is not available in Schoolbox, but we are moving in that direction. Having students self-assess their work as they submit the work is something we're really interested in. And once again, that's just one of those reasons that we really are heavily promoting rubrics, is because in order for students to self-assess well, we believe they'll need a rubric in order to do that. So getting teachers up and running with rubrics now is an important step to enabling self-assessment in the future. I'm really glad there was so many cheese jokes while we worked out the technical difficulties. It's good to see all those user group meetup people attending the meeting. Have we got any other questions? Back to the bottom of the list. If a rubric is created in courses, which teacher does it report results back to? Our own kids or the cohort? So in Schoolbox, courses are independent to a class. So you can think of course being like a template and the class being the implementation of the course. In Schoolbox, the teacher brings the course into their classroom and then owns it. So the marking and the assessment is all done at a class level. But the actual creation and templating of the rubric and the assessment task is done at a course level, so it can be easily shared across the entire cohort. But at the end of the day, it's the actual teacher in the classroom who is responsible for the assessment and the assignment of the work, the due dates, and all of the rest of the things that go along with classroom management. Peter asks, we use paper rubrics across our entire organisation already. Is digitising them a manual process, or can we upload these as is? Yes, it is a manual process, unfortunately. Paper doesn't automatically turn to bits very well. So it's one of those things that they do to digitize does take some effort and time. We're not avoiding the idea that this is a difficult process, but the value we believe in digitizing them is definitely there. Once they are digital, you can easily transport them. So in Schoolbox, we can export and import digital rubrics, but traditional paper or Word documents or spreadsheets are difficult to import without a standard format. Whereas once they're in Schoolbox and being digitized, you can move them around. You can export them as a spreadsheet, and you can re-import them across other assessments. So if you've got a few that you reuse, you can actually share them around a bit. Priyanne Cuthbert asks, for core capabilities, let's say literacy, would the idea be that all faculties use a generic capability to indicate the control of language across various subjects? I think that's a really interesting idea. The way we're looking at approaching the idea is not necessarily that they all need to use a generic capability. It may be nice, but we're actually looking in the future to map back to the curriculum. Now, the curriculum has all of these types of links in it. Systems like Atlas Rubicon and Unit Planner have developed sophisticated ways of mapping these shared skills across multiple faculties and subject areas. And we're going to be leveraging their ability to do that mapping to then do further reporting in the future. So say, for example, you have literacy in 3 different subjects or across multiple year levels. It might be called something slightly different in different year levels or in different subject areas, but it would all link back to a common curriculum strand that we could then report on that particular curriculum strand rather than that particular skill that was demonstrated in that particular subject. So ultimately, we believe that we can report from the curriculum on these types of questions rather than just using the limitations of capabilities and indicators within the rubric. So that's not there yet, but ultimately we do plan to link up the capabilities and indicators back to the curriculum so you can understand where in the curriculum these particular indicators and capabilities align with the curriculum. Ohad asks, how can we achieve having weighted rubrics? I mentioned earlier, right back at the very start, I think in the anatomy of a rubric, that in the descriptor there is points. And so for each of those points, they're effectively a weighting. They actually give you your weighted value for that particular descriptor. So you can use different point values to effectively set up a weighted skill. So you might have that indicator 1.1 is more important than any other indicator in that rubric, and you might give it more points in the rubric. So that would then indicate that that was weighted more heavily, and that would then impact the overall mark that the rubric ends up informing. So the more points given to a particular indicator will then effectively weight that particular indicator. Ohad again asks, is there a view on how a teacher can map the work assessment to rubrics? Currently, teachers find it difficult to create this mapping. There isn't, and this is probably the most difficult thing to do, which is how to map your skills back to your curriculum. The teachers have something, they might answer that offline. They're saying that they might know some information that might help. No? Rihanna? But yeah, that's difficult. There's no real easy way to do that, unfortunately. Can't offer much help on that one. Adina asks, how do we do 4-point when you are not able to change capabilities once they have been used somewhere? So one of the things about the reuse of capabilities and indicators is that once you've used an indicator, you can't actually alter it, because then you would fundamentally alter the rubrics that have been previously assessed on that indicator. So you can't go and modify an indicator once it's in use, because any rubrics that have been previously marked against that indicator won't show. So that's one of the limitations of having shared indicators across rubrics, is you can't go and modify them. So that's just to be aware of, that if you are halfway through your course and you want to change your indicators, but they've already been assessed against on 3 other assessment tasks, you can't change that indicator at that point in time because it has been used. So just be aware in Schoolbox that once they've been used, they are locked down. We are making some changes in the future to Schoolbox to enable them to be more manipulatable in the course instance where they're not actually being assessed against. So look out for those changes in the future. So Callie asks, we're keen to detach the overall grade for a task so it is not generated by an algorithm, and professional judgment is the key. If we do this, how can we achieve the overall mark appear on the teacher's mark sheets? So Kelly, in Schoolbox, that already happens. The rubric will inform the overall mark, but the teacher ultimately has discretion and can modify that overall mark. The mark that the teacher decides is the mark that will be displayed to the student, and on their mark sheet, it'll be used as that mark forever on. So you can override the rubric mark and put your own mark in. So we've decided quite a while ago that marks and rubrics are different things. We used to have rubrics as marks, but now you'll find that rubrics and marks are actually independent. And although the rubric can sort of calculate a mark, you can also set any mark you want on that assessment, completely independent of the rubric. Louise asks, can we download all online assessments and rubrics as a whole report? This would be useful as a mid-year report. Not at this stage. We can download all of the assessments as a MacBook, so you can get all of your MacBooks downloaded, but you can't download all of the rubrics as well because of the multiple dimensions of data there. So you can download all the marks, but not all the rubrics. We have a separate report that you can download that will show you all of the values that the students got for a particular rubric. So there's 2 reports you can download, one for rubrics and one for marks. Because they're both different things, they're in separate reports. Adam asks, can you link the marked rubric to a MacBook, making it easier to transfer data and eliminating chance of errors? So yes, by default, a rubric does what we call inform the mark. So based on what you select in the rubric, it will do the appropriate point calculation and work out the appropriate mark based on the scalings that have been set. But like I said before, it can be altered, so we still allow teacher discretion. So rubrics can mark and fill in the markbook, but they can also be altered by the teacher as well. Peter asks, can we use rubrics without assigning an overall mark? And this goes with what I was saying before about the separation of rubrics and marks. Yes, you can set a mark type of none and then mark the rubric. So we have schools that have been using that for more holistic assessments or perhaps behaviour or summative reporting, things like that. You can create a rubric that is just a rubric on its own with no final mark. So feel free to use that feature. You just set mark type to none and then turn the rubric on, and you can still use a rubric without a mark. Jane asks, are there more examples of good and bad rubrics on help.schoolbox? I think it's a thing on our list of things to do. We'd definitely look to do some more work in that space. We'd love to get some exemplars of rubrics up for you to all check out. We'll be doing some more work on that. For those that have done the course, you've probably already seen that we do assess using rubrics on Help. So we already use our own rubric system to assess you when you're using our online training. But we would like to get more exemplars up, I'm sure. Scott asks, just to clarify, rubrics are only available online. I'm not sure what that's clarifying. Matt asks, can rubrics comments be linked and displayed into the continuous report for each task? Yes, they can. In fact, they already are. So that's already in the system. So Matt, we do already show the rubric comments displayed on the continuous report for each task. That's already part of the system. I think I'm running out of questions. Adina asks, are there any plans to support other formats for rubrics other than CSV? No, not likely. CSV is probably the simplest and easiest format for everyone. It's probably the best way for people to upload their rubrics and transfer those files around. Other formats would just overcomplicate it. So CSV is probably the easiest way for rubrics to be disseminated. Okay, so Jenny asks, would it be a good idea to get KLA to set up a standard rubric for their assessment tasks? Would they need to look at a different rubric for each stage, i.e. year 7, 8, 9 and 10? Yes, that would be a good place to start. Each rubric would need to be different for each assessment task. So we need to be clear there that there's not a rubric for each year or stage. There's actually a different rubric for each assessment tasks. So rather than having a standard rubric for all assessment tasks, we would need a rubric specific for that assessment task, because we want the rubric to describe what is expected of the students. So it's less a curriculum tool and more a tool to inform the students of what they need to do as part of that assessment task. So when thinking about developing your rubrics, it's not about building like one rubric for the whole grade. It's about building a rubric for each assessment task. Ohad asks, is it possible to import rubric results? No, it's probably never going to be something that we do due to the issue with teachers having it's much simpler for them to use the point and click interface to mark the rubrics rather than them to take them offline and to try and do them offline in some file format. So there's probably not going to be an ability to upload marks via CSV. The same goes for our MacBook, in fact. We did originally have a MacBook upload system for teachers could upload marks, but more often than not, they would get the formatting incorrect and then it would break everything and we'd end up with a mess of results. So typically we require them to do their marking in the system where all the validation controls and all of the easy to use systems are in place so that they can actually do the marking easily. Brianne Cuthbert asks, I've not seen the student progression chart before. Where can I view that? That was a little sneak peek of the future. It hasn't been implemented yet, but it is something we're working on. But that's, I guess, a bit about our vision for where we're going to take this sort of visualization of the rubric data and why it's important. I just wanted to show that because I think it does give sort of some understanding about where we're actually heading in Schoolbox in the future and why rubrics are so critically important to continuous reporting, being able to show progression like that. So although that feature's not there yet, we want to get teachers a head start on getting rubrics into the system, because if you want to have a beautiful graph like that, we're going to need to be at a point where we have that data collected. So there's a question about the timeline for the progression. So just in terms of when we think that will be developed, for those that are not aware, we're talking about this progression view here. So this at the moment is sort of a wireframe that we've sort of been mocking up and drawing. We'll be sort of starting work on this probably late this year, looking to deliver early in the next year. But there are some caveats that come with this. This graph will only work if you have rubrics aligned to standards. If your rubrics are not really aligned to a common standard and you're not using rubrics, this type of visualization won't work. So I think it's important that we both share the responsibility. We'll develop the visualization and have it ready next year, but you'll need to start work on assessing using rubrics to get the value of this type of visualization. Will it be possible to have the cohort box for the student view in that? Oh, yeah. So there's a question, will the cohort box be possible to be removed? In fact, that's actually something that we're going to be adding in very soon. There's actually a requirement that we allow students to opt out individually from being displayed against the cohort. So we're going to be adding that in. For those that know our continuous report card, there's actually already a cohort box and whisker shown for the overall assessment grade. So we're going to be providing an opt-out option per student. So you can opt out individual students or opt in certain students depending on whether they like to have the challenge of being at the top or whether they perhaps it doesn't matter too much to them where they are positioned in the cohort. So we're going to allow that to be an individual user discretion feature. Peter asks, he's keen for a OneNote LTI webinar. Just so you up to date, Peter, I am working on the LTI specification at the moment, so that'll be coming very soon. So look forward to it. Well, if you've got per student, the question was if you can opt out, can you opt out per year level of the cohort reporting? Well, if you can opt out per student, you can do it per year level.
Without having to go tick everyone they need.
You would use the UPS system to do it per year level. So you would set the cohort to for that year, set the individuals not to have the cohort reporting on. Louise asked, are we able to track students throughout years 1 and 8? For example, we use the same writing rubric throughout year levels. Can we track the student over their 7 years? This is an interesting discussion about tracking progression over multiple years. Now, I talked earlier about aligning it to standards. Now, theoretically, if you have aligned your rubric each year to a standard, that should inherently mean that year after year, the standard should increase in each year. And so your writing rubric should get harder and harder and harder year on year. If that is the case, we can then track progression as they move by putting the rubrics end to end as they move from year to year. So theoretically, if it's all aligned to standards year on year and it all aligns back to the curriculum, we can potentially report on progression against the standard over multiple years. It is difficult. It's not something we can do yet, but it is something that we would look forward to in the future once we have good quality rubrics underlying our data collection. So a lot of this all comes back to, these questions about analysing the cohort, analysing the curriculum, analysing the year levels and the progression across year levels. All of this comes back to having good quality data. And that's why rubrics are really so important, that we need to get good quality rubrics because we can't answer these questions without the rubrics. So up front, we need the rubrics first, and then we can start answering all of these questions that you have about your curriculum and the delivery of your curriculum. There's a couple of questions. How do you align the rubric to the standards? That's obviously dependent on your curriculum that's specific to your school. So I guess in terms of how you align the rubric, we use the levels to say, to firstly say what is standard, and then we use the curriculum to define what is the standard level that's expected of a student at for this particular skill. So it's a matter of using the curriculum to define the standards and then the skills from the curriculum and what is expected as standard. So you need to do a whole lot of alignment with curriculum for that particular assessment task. Jane asks, if the standard changes partway through the year, does that affect future years, and is there a good time to change the standard? Yeah, it's going to affect things. Whenever you change your source data, you're going to have impacts. It's going to be one of those things that shows up on your visualizations and your graphs. as long as you're aware of when the change occurred and that the data won't align from one period to the next, you can safely make that change anytime, but there is no good time to make that change. We'd like to see gradual improvement rather than big sweeping changes to the data. But yeah, it is one of those things that is difficult. Okay, so rubric. Josh asks, do you create a rubric in a course or in a course unit? Okay, so just to define the terminology, a course for us is a container that contains units. Within a unit, you have assessments. So for us, the rubric is actually created in the assessment. So if you can imagine, it goes course, unit, assessment, rubric. So the rubric ends up all the way down in a unit, in a course, in a unit, in an assessment, and then in that position there. So theoretically, it's in both a course and a unit, but it's also in an assessment task as well. What that means, because it's in a course and in a unit, is that we can actually look at the course as a whole, and we can do analysis across the whole course, and we can also do analysis across the unit, and we can also do analysis across the assessment of that rubric. So we can actually cut that data up in many different ways because of that hierarchy.
All online assessments and rubrics as a whole report?
Yeah. No. Next question.
Employees.
I've got a lot of questions here, but I'm just trying to find the most valuable questions. So just give me a moment while I find some good questions that will subscribe to most people. So Kelly asks about an extra column. So I'm just going to find, Kelly's asked in two questions. So when integrating subjects in the primary years, we are using capabilities as the subject tile indicators links to strands in the curriculum. We're writing task-specific criteria in a focus column that is a level column. Could we have a way to look at this focus column so it can't be shaded in the future? I'm not entirely sure what the focus column is. But I think what you're talking about is more curriculum documentation. And this is one of the areas where people get confused with rubrics and curriculum documentation. So I think what you're referring to is actually curriculum documentation. So what is the curriculum focusing on and what are we doing in a specific task? That is different to how you assess the task. And so a rubric is very much focused on the assessment and not the definition of what you will be looking at or doing in that particular area of study. So just be aware that rubrics are purely for the purpose of assessment. So Kelly asks, are we modifying indicators? There's been a lot of questions about modifying indicators. Will archive marks lock up indicators or will they be free with yearly rollovers? The idea that we're thinking about here is that once you import your rubric onto your class, the indicator, and they're marked, those indicators will be locked forever on. But because most schools archive their class pages, that's not a problem. Now, next year, when you go to reuse that rubric, if you pull that rubric from your course, you'll have an opportunity to modify that rubric in your course before you import it. So the important thing is that the course remains editable and the class obviously gets locked down once it's been in use. So the place to build your rubrics is very clearly in the course, where you'll be able to modify them and continue to make changes and alterations to them over time. And then each time you want to implement those rubrics, you'll just copy them from your course into your class. And so next year you'll just be reusing the same rubric, but it will be altered as per your changes in the course. Jane asks, how does the setup of rubric scales and grade scales affect the overall mark? So one of the things that we've done in rubrics, which I haven't spoken about, which is Schoolbox specific, is this idea of result sets. And it's something that allows you to pre-populate a rubric with a standard set of descriptors. I don't like the idea very much, but we have it because it allows people to do criteria mark sheets, not rubrics. So that feature is specifically for doing criteria mark sheets rather than for doing rubrics. And then finally, the scales. Obviously, all the points add together, and based on the points, you'll find the grade is affected by the points and the overall points that you got out of the total of that rubric. All right, well, I think it's about time to wrap it up. I think we've gone well over time. Thank you all for coming along. Great questions. We'll continue to answer some of these questions if there's any left over. I might contact some of you offline about some of your questions. But thank you very much for coming. I hope you found it informative, what we're doing with rubrics and how we see rubrics being used and some best practice around rubrics. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar.